In the sapphire waters of the Caribbean, where trade winds carry the scent of salt and hibiscus, there lies a small island that most sailors pass without a second glance. From a distance, it looks like paradise. Palm trees sway against an endless blue sky. White sand beaches curve along the shoreline, and atop its highest point, strange structures rise like monuments to some forgotten civilization. But this island holds no paradise. Its name is Little St. James, and for more than 2 decades, it concealed one of the darkest criminal enterprises in modern American history. This is not a story about architecture or wealth or ambition. This is a story about power corrupted beyond recognition, about a system that failed the vulnerable, and about the long, painful road toward justice. To understand what happened on that island, we must first understand the man who owned it. The rise of a predator. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20, 1953 in Brooklyn, New York. He grew up in a modest household in the Seagate section of Coney Island, the son of Seymour Epstein, a Parks Department employee, and Pauline, a school aide. Nothing about his early years suggested the extraordinary wealth he would later accumulate, or the crimes he would commit under its protection. The family lived in a middle-class Jewish neighborhood, surrounded by teachers, civil servants, and small business owners who worked hard and expected their children to do the same. Young Jeffrey showed an aptitude for mathematics that set him apart from his peers, but he also displayed characteristics that would later prove significant: a talent for manipulation and a fascination with power dynamics that unsettled those who knew him well. As a young man, Epstein possessed something that would serve him throughout his life: an unusual ability to ingratiate himself with powerful people. He was charming when he needed to be, intellectually curious, and remarkably skilled at making others feel he understood them completely. He had a way of mirroring the interests and concerns of whoever sat across from him, adapting his personality like water filling a container. These qualities helped him move through worlds that should have been closed to someone of his background, opening doors that would otherwise have remained firmly shut. In 1973, without completing his college degree, Epstein somehow secured a teaching position at the Dalton School, one of Manhattan's most elite private institutions. The school educated the children of diplomats, executives, and old money families who traced their lineage back generations. How a 20-year-old dropout without teaching credentials landed such a position has never been fully explained. Some investigators believe he was hired through connections made by a family member. Others suspect the answer lies in his already developing skill at manipulation and self-presentation. What is known is that at Dalton, Epstein taught mathematics and physics to teenagers, some of whom would later describe encounters that made them deeply uncomfortable in ways they could not fully articulate at the time. Former students recalled a teacher who seemed too interested in certain students, who found reasons to spend time alone with young people, whose attention felt less like mentorship and more like something darker and more predatory. One student would later remember Epstein showing up uninvited at his home during summer vacation. Another described a pattern of behavior that she could not name at the time, but that now seemed clearly inappropriate. He was dismissed from Dalton in 1975, though the school's reasons were never made fully public. The headmaster at the time would later say the departure was not on good terms, but specific details were never released to the press or to investigators who came asking questions decades later. But by then, Epstein had made the connections that would shape his future. Through the parents of his students, he gained access to a world of extraordinary wealth and influence that existed far above his Brooklyn origins. One of those connections led to Alan Greenberg, the chairman of Bear Stearns, one of Wall Street's most prestigious investment banks. By the late 1970s, Epstein had joined the firm, trading on relationships rather than credentials that he did not possess. His rise there was meteoric by any standard. Within just 4 years, he became a limited partner, an achievement that typically required decades of proven performance and documented success. His specialty, he claimed, was managing money for clients with assets exceeding $1 billion. But Epstein's financial history remains shrouded in mystery to this day, a puzzle that even dedicated investigators have been unable to fully solve. Unlike other financiers who built their reputations on visible deals, public offerings, and documented successes that could be verified through records and witnesses, Epstein operated in shadows. He rarely appeared in financial publications. He gave no interviews about his investment philosophy. His client list, if it truly existed in the form he claimed, was never independently verified by anyone outside his inner circle. He left Bear Stearns in 1981 under circumstances that remain unclear to start his own firm, J. Epstein and Company. But the sources of his eventual fortune have never been fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. Some investigators believe he may have engaged in blackmail from the very beginning of his career, using compromising information about wealthy clients to extract payments that appeared on paper as legitimate management fees. Others suspect he served as a money manager for individuals who preferred anonymity for their own dark reasons, whether those involved tax evasion, criminal proceeds, or activities that could never withstand public scrutiny. What is certain is that by the 1990s, Jeffrey Epstein had amassed wealth that defied explanation, a fortune estimated at over $500 million by conservative measures. And with that fortune, he began acquiring the instruments of his predatory empire, the properties and vehicles and staff that would enable crimes on a scale that seemed almost unimaginable. The purchase of paradise. In 1998, Jeffrey Epstein purchased Little St. James Island from its previous owner for approximately $7.95 million. The island sits in the United States Virgin Islands, approximately 1 mile southeast of St. Thomas, visible from the mainland on clear days, but isolated enough to feel like another world entirely. It encompasses roughly 72 acres of tropical terrain, with beaches on multiple sides, rocky outcrops that drop sharply into deep blue waters, and a central hill that rises above the surrounding Caribbean to offer views that stretch to the horizon in every direction. To most buyers, it would have been a dream vacation property, a place to escape the pressures of mainland life and enjoy the simple pleasures of sun and sea. To Epstein, it was something else entirely. It was a fortress where he could control every aspect of his environment. It was a hunting ground where his victims would have no escape. It was a place where he could do whatever he wanted with no one to stop him or even to witness what occurred. The Virgin Islands offered several advantages for a man seeking to operate beyond the reach of scrutiny and accountability. Though American territory subject to federal law, the islands maintained a certain distance from the mainland's watchful eyes that made oversight difficult. The local government was small and often overwhelmed by the challenges of managing a scattered territory dependent on tourism and federal support. Law enforcement resources were stretched thin across multiple islands separated by miles of open water, making coordinated investigations extremely difficult to mount. The wealthy residents who populated the neighboring islands valued their privacy above almost everything else, creating a culture where questions were rarely asked about what happened behind closed gates or on private property. The social code of the region seemed designed to protect people like Epstein, people with money and lawyers and the appearance of respectability. And the remoteness of a private island meant that whatever occurred there would occur without witnesses who might talk to authorities or journalists. Epstein understood all of this with the clarity of a predator studying its territory. He had studied his environment with the same attention to detail that marked his manipulation of individual victims. He knew which officials could be influenced through donations and flattery, and which ones would simply look the other way if given sufficient reason. He understood that isolated communities depend on wealthy residents for jobs and economic activity, creating dependencies that discourage inconvenient questions about behavior that might drive away investment. From the moment he took possession of Little St. James, he began transforming it into a self-contained world where he would make the rules and enforce them without interference from any outside authority. Construction began almost immediately after the purchase closed. Work crews arrived from the mainland and from nearby islands, hired through layers of contractors and subcontractors that made it difficult to trace who was ultimately paying the bills and why so much was being spent on what should have been a simple vacation property. They found their new employer demanding, secretive, and paranoid about security in ways that seemed excessive even for a wealthy man accustomed to protecting his assets. Workers were forbidden from speaking about what they built to anyone outside the immediate worksite. Many were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements that threatened financial ruin for any breach of confidentiality. Those who asked too many questions about the purpose of certain structures found their employment terminated without explanation. Those who talked to outsiders about their work discovered that subsequent job opportunities in the region mysteriously disappeared. What rose from that tropical soil over the following years was unlike anything else in the Caribbean. A compound designed not for relaxation, but for absolute control. The structures of secrecy. The main residence on Little St. James was not simply a house in any conventional sense. It was a compound, designed with the same obsessive attention to control and surveillance that characterized everything Epstein touched throughout his life. The primary building featured a facade of cream-colored stucco with bright turquoise accents around the windows and doors, giving it an almost cheerful appearance from the outside. The kind of colorful tropical architecture that would look at home in any Caribbean resort brochure or travel magazine. But its design prioritized something other than aesthetics or the comfort of its inhabitants. The windows were positioned to allow observation of approaching vessels and aircraft, while limiting views into the interior from any angle that an outsider might occupy. The layout created spaces where conversations could occur without risk of being overheard, rooms within rooms, private areas accessible only through multiple doorways. Multiple entrances and exits provided options for moving guests in and out without detection, ensuring that arrivals and departures could be managed with precision. Adjacent to the main house stood what workers came to call the temple. This structure became the most notorious feature of Little St. James, its image circulating around the world after Epstein's crimes became widely known through media coverage and legal proceedings. The building resembled a small classical temple from Mediterranean antiquity, with white and blue striped walls that seemed designed to evoke Greek island villas, golden domes that caught the Caribbean sun with almost blinding brilliance, and a front entrance flanked by statues that appeared to depict mythological figures. Its architecture suggested something between a Greek religious structure and a theatrical set piece from some elaborate costume drama about ancient civilizations. The overall effect was deliberately disorienting, as if the building belonged to no particular place or time, a fantasy structure dropped into reality. Pilots who flew over the island on regular routes reported that the doors on the front facade appeared to be painted on, flat surfaces designed to create the illusion of functionality rather than actual portals that could be opened and closed. This discovery raised obvious questions about what the building actually contained and why such effort had been invested in creating a false impression of its purpose. Some observers have suggested the temple was purely decorative, an architectural folly meant to intrigue visitors and satisfy Epstein's taste for the unusual and dramatic. Others believe it concealed something darker, perhaps an entrance to underground spaces or a structure whose true purpose required disguising from aerial observation. What is known is that it was constructed with the same secrecy that surrounded every other project on the island, and that workers who questioned its purpose were quickly reassigned to other tasks or dismissed entirely. Beyond these main structures, Epstein built an extensive network of support facilities that transformed Little St. James into a self-sufficient compound, capable of operating indefinitely without outside assistance. There were staff quarters for the employees who maintained the property and served the guests. Modest buildings positioned far enough from the main house to provide privacy for the owner, but close enough for service when needed. There was a helipad for the helicopters that ferried visitors from St. Thomas, allowing them to bypass the ferry services and commercial airports, where witnesses might observe their arrivals and departures and remember faces. There was a landing strip capable of handling small aircraft, though it was eventually closed after disputes with territorial aviation authorities over proper permits and safety concerns. There were maintenance buildings, industrial generators capable of powering the entire compound independently, water treatment facilities, and all the other infrastructure necessary to support an isolated community that wanted nothing from the outside world except the supplies that arrived by boat on scheduled deliveries. Underground, according to reports from workers and subsequent investigators who examined the property after Epstein's arrest, there existed additional spaces whose purposes were never fully documented in any official building records or permit applications. Some who worked on the construction described tunnels connecting different buildings, allowing movement across the compound without exposure to observation from above. Others spoke of basement rooms that were completed behind schedule and in secret, with specialized contractors brought in after the regular crews had been dismissed for the day. These contractors signed additional non-disclosure agreements more restrictive than those required of ordinary workers, and were often housed separately in accommodations away from the main construction camp. The full extent of what was built beneath the surface of Little St. James may never be known with certainty, as Epstein took extraordinary measures to prevent any complete picture from emerging in documents or testimony. The island also featured extensive surveillance systems that exceeded anything a reasonable security concern would require for even the wealthiest individual. Cameras monitored every approach by sea and air, positioned to capture vessels and aircraft long before they reached the island's boundaries. Additional cameras covered every pathway, every building entrance, every outdoor space where guests might gather or wander. Motion sensors tracked movement through the grounds, logging activity patterns and alerting security staff to any unexpected presence or deviation from expected routines. In a world before smartphones and social media made such technology commonplace, Epstein had created a monitoring apparatus more sophisticated than many government installations. The official explanation was security. The reasonable protection of a wealthy man's privacy in an era when kidnapping for ransom remained a genuine concern for the ultra-rich and their families. The reality, as would later become clear through testimony and investigation, was far more sinister and calculated. Epstein was not merely protecting himself from intruders or documenting potential threats to his safety. He was recording everything that happened on his island, creating a comprehensive library of compromising material that gave him leverage over some of the world's most powerful people. Every bedroom, every bathroom, every private space was reportedly wired for video and audio recording. Guests who believed their visits were confidential discovered years later, when investigations began in earnest, that nothing they said or did had gone unobserved or unrecorded. The web of enablers. Jeffrey Epstein did not operate alone, and his crimes would have been impossible without an extensive network of accomplices, some who were knowing participants in his criminal enterprise, and others who served as unwitting tools in his schemes without fully understanding what they enabled. At the center of this network stood Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of the British media magnate Robert Maxwell, a man whose own life ended in scandal and suspicion of massive fraud against his employees' pension funds. Ghislaine had moved in elite circles her entire life, educated at Oxford, present at the finest parties in London and New York, connected to royalty and celebrities by birth and by careful cultivation of relationships. After her father's death in 1991 under mysterious circumstances, found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near his yacht, with speculation ranging from suicide to murder to accident, Ghislaine relocated to New York and soon became Epstein's constant companion. She moved into his orbit with the ease of someone who had been preparing for such a role her entire life, bringing with her the social credentials and aristocratic connections that Epstein himself lacked, despite all his accumulated wealth and cultivated sophistication. The exact nature of their relationship has been debated by observers and investigators alike. At times, Maxwell appeared to be his girlfriend, accompanying him to social events and sharing his multiple residences around the world. At other times, she seemed more like a business partner, managing his properties and coordinating his increasingly complex schedule of travel and appointments. To others still, she appeared to function as a chief of staff, the person who made the machinery of his life run smoothly while remaining carefully distanced from the darkest aspects of his activities. What prosecutors would eventually prove in federal court was that she served as Epstein's primary recruiter and groomer of young victims, the public face of an operation designed to identify, manipulate, and deliver vulnerable young women and girls to a man who would abuse them without remorse. Maxwell possessed what Epstein lacked, a legitimate presence in society's highest levels that did not depend on mystery or manipulation or the cultivation of carefully constructed personas. She had access to charity galas, aristocratic gatherings, royal events, and the kind of exclusive social occasions where questioning someone's background would be considered impossibly gauche. She used this access to identify vulnerable young women and girls, often from disadvantaged backgrounds or difficult family situations, who might be susceptible to promises of money, education, travel opportunities, or introduction to powerful people who could transform their lives and circumstances. The recruitment process followed a careful pattern that had been refined over years of practice and experience. Maxwell or one of her associates would approach a young woman with offers of legitimate work, massage training, modeling opportunities, or educational assistance that seemed too good to pass up. Initial encounters would seem professional and above board, taking place in respectable locations with appropriate witnesses nearby to provide reassurance. The young women would be introduced to Epstein himself, who would present himself as a philanthropist genuinely interested in helping talented young people achieve their potential and escape the limitations of their circumstances. Gradually, imperceptibly, the true nature of what was being asked would become clear. But by then, the victims were often too compromised by payments they had accepted, too confused by the sophisticated manipulation they had experienced, or too afraid of the powerful forces arrayed against them to escape the trap that had closed around them. Beyond Maxwell, Epstein employed a staff of assistants, schedulers, and household workers who facilitated his crimes through varying degrees of awareness about what they were enabling. There were pilots who flew his private jets between his various properties, aircraft that investigators would later dub the Lolita Express, ferrying passengers to and from the island without asking why so many of them were young women traveling alone. There were household staff who maintained the properties, changed the sheets, prepared the meals, and kept the machinery of luxury running smoothly, some of whom would later provide crucial testimony about what they witnessed during their employment. There were personal assistants who scheduled appointments, organized travel, and managed the complex logistics of Epstein's compartmentalized life. Not everyone who worked for Epstein understood the full scope of his activities. Many were simply employees doing jobs, deliberately kept ignorant of what happened behind certain closed doors through careful information management. But others knew. They had seen things that could not be explained away as innocent or misunderstood. They had heard sounds that could not be ignored or attributed to anything legitimate. And they had made the calculation, consciously or not, that their generous paychecks were worth their silence about matters that would have troubled any person of conscience. The island also received a steady stream of prominent visitors whose names would later shock the public when flight logs and other records became available through legal proceedings. Politicians and former presidents appeared on the manifests. Scientists and scholars flew in for discussions with their generous benefactor. Entertainers and entrepreneurs arrived seeking investment or simply the pleasure of Epstein's company and his legendary hospitality. Some of these visitors may have come to the island without participating in or even knowing about Epstein's criminal activities. The island, after all, offered the kind of luxury that legitimately attracted wealthy guests who expected such accommodation as their due, spectacular scenery, gourmet meals prepared by trained chefs, and the company of an intelligent host who could discuss almost any topic with apparent expertise and genuine curiosity. But others knew exactly what they were coming for, and their presence implicated them in Epstein's enterprise, whether they chose to acknowledge it or not. And Epstein made sure to document their activities with the same thoroughness he applied to everything else, building a library of compromising material that became perhaps his greatest source of power and protection. For years, the crimes of Little St. James remained hidden behind walls of money, influence, and carefully cultivated fear. The victims, many of them minors when their abuse began, faced obstacles that seemed insurmountable in their pursuit of justice and recognition. They were told repeatedly that no one would believe their word against that of a billionaire with powerful friends. They were reminded in subtle and not so subtle ways that Epstein had connections to prosecutors, politicians, and police officials who could make their lives extremely difficult. They were offered settlements that came with strict confidentiality clauses, payments that provided temporary financial relief while permanently silencing them about their experiences and allowing their abuser to continue his predations without consequence. But some victims found the courage to speak, despite everything arrayed against them. Their voices, at first isolated and easy to dismiss, would eventually combine into a chorus that could no longer be ignored by a system that had failed them so completely. The victims speak. Virginia Giuffre was 16 years old when she was recruited into Epstein's world. She was working at the Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, Florida, trying to support herself after a difficult childhood marked by abuse and instability. A woman approached her and asked if she would be interested in earning extra money by giving massages to a wealthy man who helped young women get started in careers. The woman was Ghislaine Maxwell, and the offer was the beginning of years of exploitation and abuse. Jeffrey was flown to Little St. James multiple times over the following years. She described arriving on the island to find herself in a world completely controlled by Epstein, surrounded by water with no way to leave without his permission. She recounted abuse that occurred in multiple locations across the property, experiences that left her traumatized and struggling to rebuild her life long after she finally escaped. She also described being trafficked to other powerful men, individuals whose names would later emerge in legal proceedings and shock the public with their prominence. But Jeffrey refused to remain silent. Despite the non-disclosure agreements she had signed, despite the threats both implicit and explicit, despite the knowledge that she was taking on one of the most connected men in America, she began speaking to journalists and lawyers about what she had experienced. Her testimony, given over many years and in multiple legal proceedings on both sides of the Atlantic, helped expose the scope of what had occurred on Little St. James and in Epstein's other properties. Other survivors added their voices as the years passed and the legal landscape began to shift. They spoke of being recruited as teenagers with promises of massage training or modeling careers that never materialized. They described the gradual process by which legitimate-seeming opportunities transformed into something dark and inescapable. They remembered being watched constantly by cameras they later learned were recording everything, understanding only in retrospect that this surveillance was part of their captivity. They recounted abuse that occurred in the main house, in the guest quarters, and in structures whose purposes they did not fully understand at the time. The psychological tactics Epstein employed were as calculated as his physical architecture and surveillance systems. He normalized the abuse gradually, pushing boundaries a little further with each encounter, until things that would have seemed unthinkable at the beginning became routine. He created a culture of complicity, encouraging victims to recruit other victims in exchange for money or favor, binding them to his enterprise through their own participation. He alternated between cruelty and generosity, keeping his victims off balance and unable to predict what treatment they would receive on any given day. And always, he reminded them of his power through casual references to the famous people who were his friends, the prosecutors he knew personally, the impossibility of anyone believing their word against his. The first investigation. In 2005, the wall of silence around Jeffrey Epstein began to crack in Palm Beach, Florida. A mother discovered that her 14-year-old daughter had visited Epstein's mansion on El Brillo Way and had been paid $300 after an encounter that deeply disturbed the young girl. Unlike so many other parents who might have been intimidated by Epstein's wealth and connections, this mother called the police. That single phone call set in motion an investigation that would reveal the scope of Epstein's crimes, while simultaneously exposing how thoroughly he had corrupted the systems meant to stop predators like him. The Palm Beach Police Department took the complaint seriously from the beginning. Detective Joseph Epstein led an investigation that quickly expanded beyond the initial report. As his team interviewed witnesses and followed leads, they discovered that the complaint they had received was merely the visible surface of something much larger and more systematic. They identified dozens of potential victims, many of them minors from working-class backgrounds who had been recruited through a network of other young women and girls. The evidence they gathered pointed to sexual abuse on a scale that shocked even officers who had spent careers investigating crimes against children. Detective Epstein would later say he had never seen anything like it in his years of law enforcement experience. The abuse was not opportunistic or impulsive, the kind of crime that occurs when opportunity and predatory impulse align by chance. It was organized, methodical, and designed to be sustained indefinitely. Epstein had created what amounted to a criminal enterprise dedicated to the sexual exploitation of minors, protected by layers of wealth, legal representation, and social connections that made him seem untouchable. The police presented their findings to the Palm Beach County State Attorney, expecting charges that would reflect the severity of what they had uncovered. Instead, they watched in disbelief as the case was elevated to federal jurisdiction, where it came under the control of the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida. The prosecutor assigned to oversee the case was Alexander Acosta, a rising star in Republican legal circles, who would later serve as Secretary of Labor in a presidential cabinet. The deal that shocked the nation. What happened next would become one of the most controversial prosecutorial decisions in modern American legal history. Rather than pursuing the aggressive prosecution that the evidence clearly warranted, Acosta entered into secret negotiations with Epstein's legal team, a group of high-powered attorneys that included former federal prosecutors, law professors, and specialists in representing wealthy clients facing serious charges. The result was what became known as the Non-Prosecution Agreement of 2008. Under its terms, Epstein would plead guilty to state charges of soliciting prostitution from a minor, a charge that dramatically understated the nature and extent of his crimes. He would serve a sentence of just 18 months in county jail rather than federal prison. And most remarkably, the agreement extended immunity from federal prosecution not only to Epstein himself, but to any unnamed co-conspirators, protecting the entire network of enablers who had helped him commit his crimes over more than a decade. The victims were not informed of this agreement until after it was finalized and could no longer be challenged through normal legal channels. Their right to be consulted under the Crime Victims' Rights Act was simply ignored by prosecutors who seemed more concerned with managing a difficult case than with serving justice. The federal judge who reviewed aspects of the agreement was not fully informed of its scope, and the public knew nothing at all about what had transpired until investigative journalists began uncovering the details years later. Epstein served 13 months of his 18-month sentence in a private wing of the Palm Beach County Stockade. But even this minimal punishment was undermined by special arrangements that seemed designed to ensure his comfort rather than his rehabilitation or the protection of the public. He was granted work release that allowed him to spend up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, at a comfortable office in downtown West Palm Beach. His personal drivers picked him up each morning from the jail. His staff continued to serve him throughout his nominal incarceration. His life during what should have been his punishment continued largely uninterrupted. When Epstein completed his sentence, he returned to his properties and his lifestyle as though nothing had happened. The structures on Little St. James still stood. His jets still flew. His staff still served. And according to multiple accounts, his abuse of young women continued, protected now by a legal agreement that seemed to guarantee he would never face real consequences for his actions. The journalist who would not stop. For nearly a decade after the 2008 agreement, Jeffrey Epstein largely disappeared from public attention. He continued to accumulate wealth, cultivate powerful friendships, and maintain his properties, including Little St. James. Occasional news stories mentioned the old case, but the details of the non-prosecution agreement remained obscure, and the victims who had been silenced remained silent. Then Julie K. Brown began investigating. Brown was a reporter for the Miami Herald, a newspaper with a long tradition of investigative journalism that had exposed corruption and criminality at the highest levels of Florida society. She had heard about the Epstein case and began looking into why a wealthy man, accused of abusing dozens of underage girls, had received what amounted to a slap on the wrist. What she discovered over months of painstaking investigation would eventually bring down one of the most protected predators in American history. Brown tracked down victims who had never spoken publicly about their experiences. She reviewed thousands of pages of court documents that had been sealed or overlooked. She interviewed former prosecutors, police officers, and others who had been involved in the original investigation. And she pieced together a narrative that revealed not just Epstein's crimes, but the systematic failure of the justice system to hold him accountable. Her series of articles, published beginning in November 2018 under the title Perversion of Justice, detailed the full scope of what had occurred. The public learned for the first time how many victims had been identified, how young some of them had been, and how deliberately the non-prosecution agreement had been designed to protect Epstein and his co-conspirators. The articles sparked outrage across the political spectrum, uniting commentators who agreed on little else in their condemnation of what had been allowed to happen. The arrest that changed everything. On July 6, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey after returning from Paris on his private jet. Federal prosecutors from the Southern District of New York, a different jurisdiction from the one that had granted him immunity a decade earlier, charged him with sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to engage in sex trafficking. The indictment described a pattern of abuse spanning years and involving dozens of victims, many of them recruited and abused on Little St. James. The arrest sent shockwaves through the worlds of finance, politics, and high society. People who had associated with Epstein rushed to distance themselves from a man who had once been welcomed in the most exclusive circles. Flight logs and photographs that had seemed innocuous took on new and sinister meanings as the public began to understand the scope of his criminal enterprise. Questions that had been asked quietly for years about how Epstein had accumulated his fortune and why he had been treated so leniently now demanded answers that powerful people seemed unwilling to provide. Epstein was held without bail at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, a federal facility known for housing high-profile defendants awaiting trial. Prosecutors argued successfully that his vast wealth, multiple properties, and international connections made him an extreme flight risk who would disappear if given any opportunity. For the first time in his adult life, Jeffrey Epstein was in a cage he could not escape through money or manipulation. The death that spawned 1,000 theories. On August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. The official cause of death was suicide by hanging. He was 66 years old. The circumstances of his death immediately sparked controversy and speculation that continues to this day. Epstein had been placed on suicide watch after an earlier incident, but had been removed from that status just days before his death. The guards assigned to monitor him had allegedly fallen asleep and falsified records indicating they had conducted required checks. The cameras that should have recorded activity outside his cell malfunctioned during the critical period. Multiple irregularities in protocol were later documented by investigators examining what had gone wrong. For the victims who had waited decades for justice, Epstein's death was devastating in ways that went beyond the loss of their day in court. They had been prepared to testify, to face their abuser, to tell the world what he had done to them. That opportunity was now gone forever. The man who had caused them so much suffering would never hear a jury pronounce him guilty. He would never spend decades in a federal prison cell contemplating his crimes. He had escaped, one final time, the consequences of his actions. But his death did not end the pursuit of justice. Prosecutors made clear that their investigation would continue, that co-conspirators would be identified and charged, and that the full scope of Epstein's criminal enterprise would be exposed regardless of his absence from the courtroom. The reckoning of Ghislaine Maxwell. On July 2, 2020, federal agents arrested Ghislaine Maxwell at a property in New Hampshire, where she had been hiding since Epstein's death. She was charged with conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, enticement of a minor to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, conspiracy to transport minors with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, and transportation of a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity. Additional charges of sex trafficking were later added. Maxwell's trial began in November 2021 and lasted nearly a month. Prosecutors presented testimony from 4 women who described being groomed and abused by Maxwell and Epstein when they were teenagers. The witnesses painted a picture of systematic recruitment, gradual boundary violations, and calculated exploitation that matched what investigators had suspected for years. Maxwell's attorneys argued that she was being scapegoated for Epstein's crimes, that she was a convenient target now that the principal offender was dead, but the jury was not convinced. On December 29, 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty on 5 of 6 counts, including sex trafficking of a minor. She was later sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, a term that will keep her incarcerated until she is an elderly woman if she serves it in full. For the victims who had testified, and the many more who had watched from outside the courtroom, the verdict provided a measure of justice that had seemed impossible for so long. The fate of the island. After Epstein's death, Little St. James became the subject of intense speculation and legal maneuvering. The property remained in his estate, managed by executors who faced the task of liquidating assets to compensate victims while navigating complex legal claims from multiple parties. In March 2022, the island was sold to Stephen Dekoff, a financier who purchased it for approximately $60 million. The sale provided funds for the victims' compensation program that had been established to provide some measure of financial restitution to those Epstein had abused. Dekoff stated that he planned to transform the property, to tear down the structures that Epstein had built and replace them with something that bore no trace of what had occurred there. The temple that had become the most notorious symbol of Epstein's island was demolished. The main house was slated for destruction. The surveillance systems were dismantled. The attempt, it seemed, was to erase the physical evidence of decades of crimes, to return the island to something like the tropical paradise it might have been if it had never fallen into Epstein's hands. But some wondered whether any amount of demolition could truly cleanse what had been built on Little St. James. The structures were merely concrete and wood and glass. The real horror had occurred in the experiences of the victims, in the corruption of the systems meant to protect them, and in the complicity of the powerful people who had looked the other way or actively participated in Epstein's enterprise. The questions that remain. Even after Epstein's death and Maxwell's conviction, fundamental questions remain unanswered about Little St. James and the criminal enterprise it served. The full extent of who visited the island and what occurred during those visits has never been completely documented in any public proceeding. Flight logs and witness testimony have revealed some names, but many believe that the complete picture remains hidden, protected by the same forces of wealth and influence that shielded Epstein for so long. The source of Epstein's fortune remains largely unexplained. Despite extensive investigation, no one has been able to fully account for how a college dropout became a billionaire through means that were never documented or verified. The possibility that his wealth came from blackmail, from serving as a financial front for others, or from sources even more sinister, has never been definitively ruled out or confirmed. The recordings that Epstein allegedly made of activities on his properties have never been publicly released or their contents fully disclosed. If such recordings exist, they could potentially implicate some of the most powerful people in the world in serious crimes. The question of who possesses these recordings now and what might be done with them remains a source of ongoing speculation, and the victims continue to seek answers and accountability. While the compensation fund has provided financial settlements to hundreds of survivors, money cannot undo trauma or restore stolen innocence. Many victims continue to struggle with the psychological aftermath of their experiences. Some have become advocates, using their voices to demand changes in how the justice system handles cases involving wealthy and powerful defendants. Others have retreated from public view, trying to build lives that are not defined by what was done to them on a small island in the Caribbean. A legacy of failure and resilience. The story of Little St. James is ultimately not just about one man's depravity or one island's dark purpose. It is a story about systems that failed at every level to protect the vulnerable from a predator who operated in plain sight for decades. It is about prosecutors who chose expedience over justice. It is about wealthy and powerful people who either participated in crimes or chose not to see what was happening in front of them. It is about a society that too often privileges the comfort of the powerful over the safety of the powerless. But it is also a story about resilience and courage. The victims who came forward despite every obstacle, who spoke truth even when they were told no one would believe them, who persisted through years of legal battles and public scrutiny, they are the real protagonists of this narrative. Their refusal to be silenced ultimately brought down a man who had seemed untouchable and sent a message that no amount of money or influence can guarantee permanent impunity. The structures on Little St. James are being demolished, but the lessons of what occurred there must not be forgotten. Every camera that was installed to record victims, every tunnel that was dug to conceal movement, every wall that was built to ensure privacy for predation, these were not just architectural features. They were instruments of a system designed to exploit vulnerability and evade accountability. Understanding how that system operated and how it was protected for so long is essential if we hope to prevent such things from happening again. The waters of the Caribbean continue to sparkle under the tropical sun. Trade winds still carry the scent of salt and hibiscus across the waves. Little St. James sits in those waters as it always has. 72 acres of land that will eventually be transformed into something new. Perhaps someday it will become the paradise it appears to be from a distance, a place of beauty rather than horror. But for those who know its history, the island will always carry the weight of what occurred there. It will stand as a reminder that evil can flourish in beautiful places, that wealth can corrupt absolutely, and that justice, though delayed and imperfect, can eventually arrive even for those who believe themselves beyond its reach. The victims who survived Little St. James carry their own memories, their own scars, their own hard-won wisdom about the nature of power and predation. Many of them continue to speak out, to advocate for other survivors, to demand that the systems which failed them be reformed so that others might be protected. Their voices, once silenced by threats and money and fear, now echo far beyond the walls that once contained them. This is their legacy, a legacy of resilience born from suffering, of truth spoken into silence, of justice pursued against impossible odds. The dark story of Little St. James is not just about the crimes that occurred on that island. It is about the survivors who refused to let those crimes remain hidden forever, who fought until the world could no longer look away, who proved that even the most powerful predator can be brought down by the courage of those he sought to destroy. The island may be transformed, the buildings may fall, the perpetrators may face judgment in this life or the next. But the truth of what happened on Little St. James will endure as a warning and a testament, a reminder of how far humanity can fall and how bravely it can rise in response.